On Tuesday, President Donald Trump became the 13th United States president to meet with Queen Elizabeth II since 1951 when he ventured to Buckingham Palace for tea as part of his first official state visit to the United Kingdom. Newsweek took a look at the 12 other presidents to have met the Queen, dating back to when she was only a princess. Each meeting had a unique characteristic, including one president accidentally kissing the Queen Mother on the lips and another giving the Queen an iPod. 1951, President Harry Truman. While the Queen didn't begin her reign until 1952, she stepped in for her father, King George VI, who was in declining health, for a 1951 state visit to the United States. Then Princess Elizabeth met with then-President Harry Truman and his wife, then First Lady Bess Truman. She and her husband, Prince Philip, stayed with the Trumans at Blair House, according to the White House Historical Association. Fun fact, Truman was the only president that the Queen met in an official diplomatic capacity, when she was a princess. 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower. Then President Dwight Eisenhower hosted Queen Elizabeth II's first state visit to the United States since her coronation in 1957. She then returned the favor in 1959 when she hosted him as a guest at Balmoral, the royal estate in Scotland, according to BBC America. Seeing a picture of you in today's newspaper standing in front of a barbecue grilling quail reminded me that I had never sent you the recipe of the drop scones which I promised you at Balmoral. I now hasten to do so, the Queen wrote to Eisenhower in a letter obtained by BBC America. We remember with such pleasure your visit to Balmoral, and I hope the photographs will be a reminder of the very happy day you spent with us. Fun fact, Eisenhower served as Supreme Allied Commander in London and had developed a friendship with the Queen when she was still a princess, as well as her parents. 1957, President Herbert Hoover. Former President Herbert Hoover's time in office had already been over for 24 years by the time he and the Queen crossed paths. One stop on the Queen's royal tour of the United States was a luncheon at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, where she gave a speech, according to CNN, and Hoover was seated next to her. Fun fact, during this visit to America, the Queen went and saw Jamestown, Virginia, the first American settlement. 1961, President John F. Kennedy. During her meeting with then-President John F. Kennedy and then First Lady Jackie Kennedy, the Queen threw a banquet in their honor, which Kennedy recounted in a birthday note to the monarch. May I also at the same time say how grateful my wife and I are for the cordial hospitality offered to us by Your Majesty and Prince Philip during our visit to London last Monday, he wrote, according to Southern Living. We shall always cherish the memory of that delightful evening. Fun fact, photographer Cecil Beaton wrote in his diary that Jackie Kennedy told him that she was unimpressed by Buckingham Palace and Queen Elizabeth's dress and hairstyle, according to The Telegraph. 1969, President Richard Nixon. In 1969, then-President Richard Nixon received a tour of Buckingham Palace from the Queen and Prince Philip, according to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. In October 1970, then First Lady Pat Nixon and the President visited with the Queen and Prime Minister Edward Heath at Chequers. Fun fact, Prince Charles and Princess Anne visited the Nixons at the White House in 1970 before the couple came to England. 1976, President Gerald Ford. Then President Gerald Ford and his wife, then First Lady Betty Ford, hosted the Queen and Prince Philip at the White House for a state dinner in July 1976. The celebration was to commemorate the bicentennial of the American Revolution, according to the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum. Betty Ford wrote in her memoir that a tent was erected for the Queen's dinner because of the number of events. Using the tent allowed the events to carry on without having to close the White House to the public for a large portion of the summer. Fun fact, an hour and a half before the Queen's dinner, there was a sudden downpour and 3 trees on the White House's property were struck by lightning. 1977, President Jimmy Carter. The Queen hosted then-President Jimmy Carter at Buckingham Palace in 1977 for a dinner with North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, leaders. The two had previously met the year before when the Queen was in Washington, D.C., for the bicentennial when Ford was in office. Fun fact, during the visit, Carter kissed the Queen Mother on the lips, according to BBC America. 1980, President Ronald Reagan. During his term in office, Reagan and the Queen met on numerous occasions beginning in 1980, according to BBC America. Reagan also greeted the Queen in Santa Barbara, and over the next few days, the two bonded, and along with her husband, the Queen even celebrated the Reagans' 31st wedding anniversary together, according to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. Following his time in office, in 1989, Reagan was made an honorary Knight Grand Cross of the Most Honorable Order of the Bath, the highest honor Britain gives to Americans. Fun fact, the Reagans were the first presidential couple to be invited to stay overnight at Windsor Castle in 1982. 1991, President George H. W. Bush. In 1991, then President George H. W. Bush and then First Lady Barbara Bush hosted the Queen and her husband at the White House for a state arrival ceremony and dinner. Fun fact, together, they planted a linden tree to replace one that was planted in 1937 to honor the ascension of her father, King George VI, but was felled during a storm, according to the White House Historical Association. 1994, President Bill Clinton. And President Bill Clinton first met the Queen at a banquet held in England in honor of the 50th anniversary of World War II's D-Day, according to Reuters. The President, then First Lady Hillary Clinton, and then first daughter Chelsea Clinton also traveled to England in 2000 and visited Buckingham Palace. Fun fact, in his autobiography, Clinton wrote that he thought the Queen would have been a successful politician or diplomat if she wasn't born into royalty. 2003, President George W. Bush. Then President George W. Bush traveled to England in 2003 for a state visit, which included a state banquet. During his trip to London, he also met with then Prime Minister Tony Blair, and the two ventured to a pub together. Bush also hosted the Queen in Washington, D.C., in 2007, and during his speech he pointed to the two nations' joint efforts to combat global terrorism. Fun fact, when her son, Prince Charles, visited the President and First Lady, he joked that they shouldn't try to set up then first daughters Jenna and Barbara with his sons, Princes William and Harry, according to BBC America. 2009, President Barack Obama. While in London for the G20 summit, then President Barack Obama met with the Queen and gave her an iPod that contained videos and photos of her visits to America, as well as songs, according to the New York Times. The President and his wife, then First Lady Michelle Obama, visited England on another occasion for a state dinner, which they reciprocated by holding a state dinner on U.S. soil as well. Fun fact, former Obama National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes said the President compared the Queen to his grandmother because the two are both courteous, straightforward, and don't suffer fools, according to People. 2018, President Donald Trump. In July, President Donald Trump traveled to the United Kingdom following a NATO summit. During his visit to England, he met the Queen, who he said has a great and beautiful grace about her.